my goal today is to raise awareness about where we are and the overall context, where we need to go and how we might get there, as well as what some of the challenges along the way are going to be. And I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Joseph said already, because I think they're important. One is that we're only going to be able to work at the speed and scale required to address the impacts of climate change and to actually help food make a positive contribution to climate change if we can work together. That means we've got to revisit the issue of competition law. We've already started a platform to look at this, and we've brought lawyers together from the EU, North America, et cetera, to have a look at this. And their sense is that there's nothing actually preventing companies from working together around sustainability. But there's a lot of cultural issues that do, and a lot of senior managers and C-suites and CEO executives in companies, especially counsel, that are not necessarily in favor of it. We still haven't quite embraced that we're all on this planet together and sustainability is a shared journey. And that's, I think, something that's really going to have to happen. The other is the issue of transparency and traceability in global supply chains. This isn't how commodities were created. They were created to be traded and mixed up so that you didn't need to know where they were from. You just needed to know that they were all equivalent and they could be used in a recipe or in a formulation without actually changing it every time. The challenge to commodities, and particularly to traders, is now that we need to know where and how something was produced. And I think that's going to be really significant. It's a steep learning curve going forward. So I come from the middle part of the US. I grew up on a farm. We had a saying there that goes something like this: if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So we're trying to get to a 1.5 degree Celsius world. We're trying to hold the increases in temperature to that amount. That's the goal. Right now, food production is the biggest threat to all life on Earth. And it's a huge contributor to climate change. And in fact, it's the contributor to climate change that we, in some ways, we know the least about and is going to be the hardest to fix. It's the largest cause of biodiversity loss, of habitat loss, use of fresh water, overexploitation of seafood, loss of topsoil, most chemical use of any activity on the planet, and a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. We can't really get away from the equation that population times consumption has got to equal the planet, and today it doesn't. About every August, we have run out of the renewable resources that the Earth is producing each year, and we're starting to eat into the principle, if you will, of the planet. Whatever the impacts are that are acceptable with 7.5 billion per capita won't be with 10 billion, and that's the challenge. We can't have relative improvements in greenhouse gas emissions. We need absolute reductions. And I don't know a single sector in the food part of the equation that is really grappling with that at this point. At times it feels like we're trying to drive the car by looking out the rearview mirror. And that's actually kind of dangerous. It's also not going to get us where we want to go. There's a famous ice hockey player that said the reason that he was so good at ice hockey is that he skated to where the puck will be, not where it was. I think that's where we all are at this point. We need to become that hockey player and to figure out where we're going and how we're going to get there. One of the things that I spent a large part of my career on was attempting to improve global commodity production by establishing standards of what acceptable impacts would be along the key impacts, usually just 6 or 8, ideally performance measurable standards, because in fact, if you give a producer a regulation or a practice that they need to comply with, you'll get compliance, but you won't necessarily get improvement. Whereas if you have set a standard and you don't say how they have to get there, then you'll find that they improve far, far more. But the biggest issue here, and they're very innovative. The biggest issue, though, is that what research has begun to show is that the bottom 25% of producers, those over here on the left-hand side of this slide, actually produce about 50% of all the impacts, but only about 10% of the product. So if we want to focus on really improving performance, we don't focus on the top side of this graph. We focus on the left-hand side. That's where we're going to get the most improvements over time. But we also need common metrics and methodologies. Right now, we have many different forms of LCAs. The EU is trying to establish just one by 2024. Hopefully that will then begin to have just one in North America and one in other places. But even the science-based targets methodologies are fraught with problems because they're actually based on global averages. And research that we've done actually shows that producers using the same method of production, the same production system for the same commodity will have 10x differences in what their impacts are. But if those same producers are producing the same commodity with a different production system, the differences can be 100x. So averages don't really get us where we need to go. What we need to do is start looking at how can we create an escalator where we can push the bottom against the performances of what the better producers are already doing. How can we move up that bottom, but use the same methods, use the same basic metrics, etc. Just require improved performance. And this concept of a codex planetarius is an idea of how we can begin to get the bottom on the escalator through global trade to become more sustainable over time. Producers are never going to be equal across the board, but they can all get better, and that should be our goal. We've also got to take waste out of the system. We don't have to produce as much food if we can actually waste less of it. We're currently wasting about a third or even more of it with our, if you look at post-harvest loss and and loss down the supply chain into the consumer and post-consumer areas. But here's the question is, do we maybe now need a new waste metric? For example, climate loss. We're not measuring the amount of food that's not produced, the kind of pre-harvest loss, if you will, because of a delay in planting, or because a field is not able to be planted at all, because of extreme weather where crops are destroyed in the field, because of the increased incidence of pests and other diseases, etc., or the temperature increases and impacts on both plants and animal production. We're seeing just last week an article in Science that suggested animal production will decline by 10 to 15% just because of heat. Guess what? Mammals really don't like hot weather. And so the hotter the weather, the less they produce. These are things that we need to start measuring so that we can anticipate where we're headed. And then there's the 800-pound gorilla, which is climate change and food production. The issue here isn't about what to think, it's how to think. As the science gets better, I think, though, we realize that we're actually worse off than we thought. To achieve a 1.5 degree world that doesn't get warmer than that is going to require nature. We need those carbon stocks in forest. We need plants that can suck down some of the oxygen, etc. But if we're going to have nature to achieve that world we want, we've got to get where and how we produce food right. Because right now, food is the biggest threat to nature. It's about habitat loss, deforestation, grassland conversion, etc. But it's also about many other things. This is just looking at how different kinds of degradation have stepped up during and are the cause of increased greenhouse gas emissions, looking at deforestation and degradation, conversion of grasslands, mega droughts, coral bleaching, depletion of fish stocks, degraded soils, even shifts of major cropping areas. One question that comes to mind, if this is the projection of corn production in the US, the question is, where is the next Midwest in the global food system? And then we're seeing things like wildfires. Nobody really paid much attention, but Siberia had a wildfire this past year that was bigger than all the other wildfires combined. And the permafrost in Siberia is melting so that we're seeing more and more of that land being turned into cropland. The Chinese are already analyzing what soils are going to be good to produce crops there. And in fact, the Russian Far East is the country where soy production has increased the fastest in the last decade. And that's true, actually. Canada is number 2, and Ukraine is number 3, or at least was. Climate change is already degrading the environment and it's displacing people. So who is beginning to measure these impacts? We saw that with COVID, one of the biggest reasons that people were able to react and governments could react was because literally on the front page of every newspaper, or every news source, or whatever your form of information was, there would be a report on each day on what the number of people infected, what the number of people in hospitals, what the death rate was. We're not doing anything like that. We will know that we have begun to get our arms around climate change and its impacts when we start reporting what the death rate is from climate change, when we start reporting what the impact of climate change is on the food that we need for all the people on the planet. So this is how it's affected not just corn, but soybeans. And the question is, what will come in after these crops? Will it be cotton? Will it be sorghum? Will it be other crops that require less water and are more drought tolerant? But it's not just row crops, it's also tree crops. If you look at cocoa, this was the projection of the land suitable for cocoa production in 2000. And this is what it looks like according to the projections in 8 years. Now, climate change is posing real problems for tree crop producers. And it's worst actually for small farmers. There are steep production declines already, 15, 20, 30, 40, in some countries even 50% declines in coffee production. And we know that on average, it may be as much as 50% by 2040, 2050 declines in coffee. We're going to need to replant tree crops every 8 to 12 years. What farmers have access to capital to do that? What market mechanisms can be used to create the assets that farmers can use to go and borrow money? And are the markets going to allow farmers the kinds of genetics they need? You can't do traditional plant breeding with tree crops and get new trees with different varieties every 8 to 12 years. So we've got to be able to use genetic engineering and issues like that to address this issue. But we've also got to find a way to finance the small farmers, or else they're going to move to other regions, they're going to move out of farming entirely, or they're going to just become displaced people. And it's not going to get better anytime soon. This is the projection for how dry it's supposed to be globally during the decade of the 2030s. And it's quite likely that in places like the US, we're already beginning to see dust bowl conditions like existed in the US in the 1930s. Those are already starting to come back. So all of this is going to lead to displacement of people because of climate change. And many had thought that that was really probably going to be coastal residents from sea level rises. And it certainly will be in part that, but at least half of this 1 to 1.5 billion that are expected to be displaced by 2050 are going to be farmers and farm workers. And the question is, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? And what is that impact going to be on the environment? But I think the bigger takeaway for me is that business as usual will simply be more difficult in the 21st century. We're going to have to swim harder to stay in the same place. It's looking like climate change itself is going to erode primary productivity by 10 to 15%, both on land and in the food webs in water. And so those things are going to have to be overcome just to continue to produce what we are producing, much less what we need for a larger population with more income to spend. We're going to need new tools and new business models. I think many assume that increased efficiency and productivity are all we need to do, but they are not going to allow for the transformational change that we need. In fact, they may be impediments to the very types of changes that we need going forward. At the very least, they're more likely to maintain poverty and push children off farms because the assets are worth less, because they can make less money. That's not the kind of system that we need for recruitment and retention in the food business. Long-term contracts, we're seeing this happen, begin to be a much bigger issue now. Mars now has 15-year contracts that they've negotiated on cocoa production, where they're offering a base price as well as incentives for improvement, both on social externalities and impacts as well as environmental ones. Other companies are following suit, but the point is that long-term contracts actually become an asset, and that asset can be borrowed against. And those are the ways we need to think about how we use markets to change markets. We need to reinforce the what markets already do, but also find ways that they can do more. We don't want to replace the current finance system, but we want to find a way that producers can go to it with greater assets, so they can borrow the money, they can have a living income while they go through the valley of death, as with tree crops, before they actually have any, between when they make their investment and when they have any new income. So we've got to get beyond greening the supplier to actually greening the supply chain, to greening the entire supplier company and everybody they buy from and everybody they sell to. And this is where working together is going to send the right market signals. And we need to learn a lot faster. The Global Salmon Initiative is a group of 17 companies that in 8 years worked together to share all their production information and reduce key impacts so that 50% of global salmon was certified in just 8 years. Now they're taking on identifying where their greenhouse gas emissions are, collecting data on it, sharing the data about what works and what doesn't, in order to reduce those impacts by 50% by 2030. Global fisheries are buyers are beginning to realize that they depend on resilient fisheries. And now a number of them are starting to put funds into fisheries improvement projects, and they're basing their payments on the volume and the value of the fish they currently buy. There's a percentage of that goes into a fund to have a more sustainable management system. The reason that's so important is because fish may be under one country today and under a different country tomorrow, because climate change is causing global fisheries to move. And we need the systems to track them if we want to understand what sustainable offtake is over time. We need to anticipate change, not react to it. And I think, just a few slides here at the end to show why this is important. These are the top 8 food exporting countries of oilseeds and cereal grains. They're about 65% or more of all the cereals exported each year, and about 85% of all the oil seeds. Just 8 countries. They don't feed the world. What they do is fill the cracks when there are reductions or losses or food shortages in different parts of the world. And we've relied on them for longer than just this century to do that. This past year, 3 of these, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada, actually had lower production, which resulted in higher prices. Canada is actually importing grains from the US this year. So even these countries that are the most productive are going to experience damage when it comes to climate change periodically. It's going to be rolling. It's not going to necessarily be predictable. It's not going to be chronic in one of these countries. But the thing I haven't even mentioned yet, because they're not the major exporters, are India and China. We haven't had a major drought and famine in either of those countries for a few decades. But as soon as climate change starts affecting production in those 2 countries, then the world is in a very different place, because as the old saying goes, when China buys rice, the world trembles. We need to understand that that's likely to happen, and we need to anticipate it. But then another one of those 8 countries is the Ukraine, where war is definitely disrupting even just the evacuation of product today, with the ports closed to the Ukraine, and they can't get all the food out. They're trying to export by rail. And then with economic sanctions that are on Russia, which is another of the 8 countries that export. So basically, 5 of the 8 countries right now are compromised, and this is going to have implications. We're already seeing right now price spikes because of the pandemic, first of all, and then because of the Ukraine war, that were far higher actually than those that triggered the Arab Spring. And we have a drought right now in North Africa and the Middle East, which is producing the exact same kinds of conditions because of high grain prices, and particularly wheat, which come from Ukraine and Russia, are 25% of global wheat exports. That's going to be an issue that we need to be monitoring. So the lessons for me from COVID is we can act without imperfect science and correct it as we go. We need to build the plane as we fly it. No company or country can address global issues on their own. They've got to start working together, and they've got to find ways that they can do that, both legally but also culturally. And I think the latter may actually be harder. And we've got to start reporting on the impacts as a way to build awareness. When we start seeing data on the front page of things about the impact of climate change, how many climate deaths there's been to date, then we will start acting on it. And until then, we probably will be slower off the mark. So deforestation and conversion-free products is not an if, but a when. 2025 is critical. The science now is showing that any cutoff date that's later than that will require a lot of sacrifices elsewhere. But the most important thing, I think, is that we already know from the science we've got that the climate impacts set in motion now will be felt until 2500. This is not a question of the next 30 years, the next 50 years, or even your kids or grandkids. This is a question of 21 generations. How do we address that? That's the challenge. Think about it.